Chapter 12. Lady's smiles seemed to float next to Rose as they descended into the crowded ballroom after having been announced and greeting their host and hostess. Rose could see that it was going to be a successful event. Their hostess would be gratified by the number of people who had accepted her invitation and were cramming themselves into the elegantly appointed, but not overly large, room. Rose hoped that meant she would be able to ever so discreetly seek out Alex and arrange to meet up on the morrow, if he were indeed present. Slowly descending, Rose gazed about at the milling multitude, struggling to distinguish faces in the crowds. Plastering a pleasant, social smile onto her face, she turned to check on her mother, hoping she would be all right on her own. Feeling a niggle of worried guilt, Rose solicitously got her settled amongst her friends before going off to pursue her own activities. Bumping into Emmeline and her sister, Rose exchanged pleasantries for a moment before Emmeline was swept off to the dance floor by a pleasant gentleman. Unfortunately, Constance was rather more difficult to carry a conversation with once her sister was absent. Rose made the effort, deciding it was excellent practice for her future life as a society hostess. "Have you been having a pleasant evening, Lady Constance?" "Very pleasant, thank you, Miss Rose." "Good, good. Did you do anything particularly interesting today?" "Not particularly, miss." "That is unfortunate. I made a few lovely morning calls this afternoon. It was most pleasant." "Oh, how pleasant." Rose began to find it to be an amusing game and persevered. "You look lovely this evening, Lady Constance." "Thank you so very much, Miss Rose." For a moment Constance looked gratified by her compliment, but then she again looked confused and slipped back into vacuity. "You look lovely this evening, too." "Why, thank you so much, Lady Constance. I cannot say that shopping is my favourite activity, but I am pleased with this particular purchase. I think my modiste did a smashingly good job." Rose tried to keep her grin within bounds, but feared she failed miserably. Gratifyingly, Constance responded to a conversational gambit. "How could you possibly not enjoy shopping, Miss Rosamond? Just this afternoon my sister and I spent an enjoyable few hours on Bond Street. It is one of the very best parts of coming to town. You should see the darling gowns I ordered, and Emmeline bought a perfectly scrumptious hat to go with her new riding habit. The dressmakers here are so much better than the ones in the village near our estate. I do declare I would happily shop every day." "Lady Constance, I had no idea. Perhaps I ought to accompany you on a visit to Bond Street, and you can show me how to have an enjoyable time there." "That would be my pleasure any time you would like, Miss Rose." Rose was happy that she had managed to have what amounted to a real conversation with the other young woman, but, blessedly, Lord Kenneth came to claim her hand for the dance before she had to come up with any more conversational efforts. "Thank you, my lord. How could you possibly have known that I most particularly wanted to dance the quadrille?" Rose asked playfully. The young lord looked slightly embarrassed by her question, but manfully responded, "Does not everyone love the quadrille, Miss Rosamond? I thought you looked particularly fetching this evening, and wanted to twirl you around the dance floor for this number." "Well, I thank you kindly for the invitation, my lord." For a moment the dance took them apart from each other, but they were able to resume their conversation as they repartnered. "Are you enjoying your evening, Miss Rose?" he asked pleasantly. "I am, very much so, thank you, my lord," she replied, smiling as she had the surprise evident in her tone. He must have noticed, and was not such a dullard as to ignore it. "Why do you sound so surprised, Miss Rose?" "In all honesty, the season has not been my idea of a rollicking good time up until now. I cannot say that I particularly enjoy the large crowds of people, and the constant need for gossip wears on my ears. On the other hand, I love the dancing, and I have met some lovely people that are fast becoming good friends, so I think it is turning out to be a good experience. But I sounded surprised because just a week or two ago I would not have been able to fathom the possibility of having a good time at an event such as this." "You are not the usual sort of debutante, are you?" he asked, with a tease in his voice. "I think perhaps many debutantes find the season is not quite what they had anticipated. They just manage to hide it better than I do, Rose replied with a cheeky grin. They were again separated, but when they returned to their places, Rose asked her partner, "Have you had much opportunity to talk with Lady Constance? I had a lovely conversation with her just before you invited me to the dance." "I apologize if I interrupted," he began before he answered her question. "But no, I cannot say that I have ever managed to have a conversation with Lady Constance. In all honesty, I thought I was rescuing you when I asked you to dance." "Well, thank you ever so much for the gallantry," Rose grinned. "But you may be surprised to know that if you try hard enough, you can get a conversation out of her. I asked her about shopping and was shocked and nearly speechless by the results. You should try it, my lord. She really is a lovely girl." Rose would never have considered herself to be a matchmaker, but she found she quite enjoyed the prospect of matching up various of her acquaintances. Neither of these two were wordy talkers, but they both seemed to be kind individuals. Rose thought Lord Kenneth's quiet kindness and strength would be a lovely match for Lady Constance's shyness. Rose could almost see the wheels turning in his lordship's thought processes as he mulled over her words. She was not at all surprised when he escorted her back to Constance and then invited that young lady to the next dance. Rose was standing on the side of the dance floor, momentarily alone, smiling happily, when she heard a quiet voice behind her. "Why are you grinning like the Cheshire Cat?" It took a great deal of willpower to control her reaction, as she felt a shiver creep up her spine and her skin break out in gooseflesh. "Good evening, Your Grace," she replied, without turning around or looking at him. Anyone watching would not even know they had acknowledged one another, at least not yet. Rose plied her fan to hide the movement of her lips. "You look lovelier than ever, Miss Rose," Alex complimented from behind her, keeping himself obscured by an artfully placed potted fan. Rose could feel a blush creeping up her cheeks, but steadfastly kept her gaze upon the dance floor, waving the fan more vigorously in an attempt to stem the rising tide of her blush. Ignoring his comment and keeping her voice just above a whisper, she muttered, "I really need to speak to you quite urgently." "There is a broom closet just beyond the retiring rooms. Go get yourself a glass of punch, and then, if no one is watching, head toward the ladies' retiring room. If still no one is around, I will whisk you into the broom closet for a moment of speech." "Your Grace, I am absolutely certain that is a terrible idea," she stated, with a laugh sounding in her voice. There was no reply from behind her, as Alex had already left. Glancing around, Rose saw that it did not appear that anyone had taken any notice of her. To be on the safe side, she took a turn about the room slowly, keeping her eye on the dance floor, watching out for her friends and glancing around to check on her mother. Seeing that everything seemed to be in its place for the moment, Rose thought that she just might be able to pull off such a questionable stunt. She set off for the refreshment room at a brisk pace, reasoning that no one would stop her if she looked like she knew what she was doing. A sudden attack of nerves made her mouth dry, and she was grateful for Alex's suggestion that she have a glass of the delicious punch. Rose was surprised by the quality of the cool drink. So often it seemed barely more than flavoured water. She dithered for a moment over the punch bowl, wondering if she should abandon the idea of trying to speak to Wrentham this evening, and worrying about the consequences if they were caught meeting in a broom closet, and wondering if the Duke had already arrived. Giving herself a silent scold for being so missish, she forced some steel into her backbone. After looking around to ensure no one was looking at her, she eased her way toward the retiring room. Stepping just past the door to that room, she almost squeaked as she felt a large, warm hand haul her from behind into a small room, and then all was darkness. "Alex?" she asked in a shaky whisper. "Of course it's me, you silly widget. Who else did you think it was?" He teased her mercilessly in the darkness. Rose took a gulp of air as she struggled to deal with all the conflicting feelings she was experiencing in that moment. The nerve-induced adrenaline that was coursing through her veins was leaving her legs feeling jiggly and weak. But the thing uppermost in her mind was the unexpected sensation of being pressed up against the firm muscles of the Duke of Wrentham's chest. He had certainly changed since their childhood days, and she was struggling to sort out her feelings on the matter. "What are you doing, Your Grace?" she hissed at him, as she felt him rubbing her back in a soothing gesture. It was obvious to Rose that he had picked up on her attack of nerves. She was comforted by the gesture, and had to remind herself that he was her enemy, and that they had only teamed up in order to deal with an even bigger enemy. She put her hands between them and shoved against his chest. In the confines of the small space he could not go far, but at least he was no longer touching her. He was still disconcertingly close, and it was as though being in the dark made it that much more intimate. He smelt surprisingly fresh, despite the warmth of the ballroom they had just left, as though he had just bathed with some sort of lemon soap. His breath, which wafted by her in the close confines of the closet, carried hints of the glass of port he must have enjoyed recently. She even noticed the rich scent of his highly polished leather shoes. She could not understand why even the sound of his breathing made her breathless. She was left feeling strangely impatient. "Why did you arrange for such an unorthodox meeting, Alex?" she demanded, sounding angry. "I apologize, Rosie. I thought you wished to speak with me urgently." He finally spoke, and his voice sounded strange to Rosie's ears. She thought it must be from the strain of whispering. She hoped to put an end to this ridiculous episode as quickly as possible. "You are right. I do need to speak with you. But surely we cannot be in this closet for very long, or we are sure to be discovered. Then we will be in the suds for certain." "Have you discovered something of use to us?" "Yes. Lady Yorkley was most helpful when I visited her today. But there is so much to tell you, and I cannot bear to be here in the dark," she whispered urgently. "Could you arrange to meet me early in the morning tomorrow, instead of the day after like we had planned?" "Sure, yes, no problem. That could easily be arranged. You were right, this was not one of my wisest moves. You should probably go. I will stay here. If anyone sees you emerging, just say you mistook the door to the retiring room. I will wait a sufficient while before I follow suit." "All right, Alex. Are you quite well? You sound rather strange." Rose was now concerned. Yes, quite well. Perhaps there is rather too much dust in the broom closet. Now out you go." Rose could feel that her face was displaying how dubious she was about his statement, but as there was only the faintest sliver of light coming in from under the door, it was quite obvious the Duke could not see it. She refrained to comment and merely opened the door a sliver, peeked out, and hurried to leave. Luck must have been on her side that night, as no one was about when she made good her escape. She decided to adjourn to the ladies' retiring room for a moment to collect her thoughts before rejoining the crowds in the ballroom. Alex was left to stew in the broom closet. This was certainly not his brightest move, Alex mused to himself as he willed his rioting feelings under control. He should not be having any sort of warm feelings for Miss Rosamond Smythe. Nothing could come of them, despite the love he had felt for her the past 16 years. He had been 10 years old when 4-year-old Rosie had stolen his heart. He had been sitting behind the garden sheds, crying over some hurtful thing that had occurred in his family. At this point he could no longer remember the exact cause of his grief, as it had not been a rare thing. What had been the rare thing was the tender compassion clearly visible in the little girl's eyes. "There, the little Rosie had said as she patted his back gently. "It's best to let it all out for a couple minutes and then stop. If you don't let it out, it stays all inside you. But if you cry too long, your eyes will hurt." Her 4-year-old wisdom had been indisputable, and his tears had instantly dried. As a 10-year-old, he hated anyone knowing that he could possibly give way to tears. But since she was barely more than a baby, it didn't really matter. She probably cried all the time herself. He had been wrong about that. The sweet-natured little girl so rarely gave way to tears. But, of course, she didn't have as many reasons to cry as he had at that time. Her parents still appeared to care about each other, and, as far as he could tell, no one ever lied to his Rosie. Alex gave his head a shake to rid himself of the bittersweet memories. It mattered not how delightful he had always found her. It was no longer possible for a Wrentham to pursue any sort of a relationship with a Smythe. Perhaps if he had reminded himself about 1,000,000 more times, he would be able to convince his heart to stop racing every time he caught sight of her. If she would just stop looking more beautiful every time he laid eyes upon her, it would no doubt be an easier task for him to accomplish. And if he could stop finding her earnest concern for the strange situation she had discovered so endearing, surely he would be able to put her from his mind once more. If they could get this Broderick nonsense straightened out quickly, he could get on with finding himself a duchess and retire back to the country. Once Rose found herself a husband, there would be no need for their paths to cross very often in the future. That thought should have brought him a measure of happiness, rather than the sinking feeling he was experiencing in that moment. A grunt of frustration escaped him, which he quickly stifled lest someone hear him. After another moment of hesitation, he too stepped from the closet. Alex was not as lucky as Rose. The moment he had shut the door, he heard an incredulous voice behind him. "Is there something amiss, Your Grace?" The Duke gritted his teeth to prevent the vulgarities that threatened to slip through his lips at being caught out. It would certainly not do to tell off one's host. Alex gritted his teeth and did his best to brazen it out. As he was turning to face his host, it crossed his mind how ironic it was that Rose had been so concerned about his feelings towards subterfuge, and here he was, about to play as big a part as any she had. Alex was uncertain what his face was revealing, but from the look on the ambassador's own face it must have been convincing, as his lordship looked truly concerned. Because of the worry on Lord Chatsworth's face, Alex wondered idly what the poor man was thinking. This struck his ready sense of humour, and he had to struggle to suppress an inappropriate urge to chuckle. Now was certainly not the time. He would have to remember to tell Rose about it in the morning, he thought to himself as he opened his mouth to address the ambassador. "My Lord Chatsworth, naught is amiss. Thank you so much for your concern. I was in need of relieving myself." Alex couldn't help the blush that he could feel creeping up his cheeks at this revolting conversational gambit. Remembering that the man is an ambassador, Alex hoped fervently that the man was not into spying as well, and did not see through his ridiculously thin excuse. Now Lord Chatsworth looked appalled. "And you thought to relieve yourself in the broom-closet?" Alex felt his lips twitch with amusement over his host's tone of voice, despite the awkwardness of the situation. Mustering a degree of dignity, Alex strove for the jovial tone of one who had imbibed a little too much. Forcing a chuckle, Alex waved the other man's words away. "Of course not, my good man. I was merely looking for the appropriate location. How was I to know that was a broom-closet? I thought it an ideal spot for a water-closet." Lord Chatsworth was clearly torn over how to address the tipsy young Duke. His respect for the Duke's title won out. "Your Grace, we have not yet gotten around to upgrading the entire house with plumbing. We do not have a water-closet on this floor, but if you would care to follow me, I will show you to the room that has been set aside for such a necessity. In the future, should you have such a need again, feel free to ask a footman to direct you." Alex was impressed with the other man's words. They implied that at least some of the house had been upgraded with plumbing. Most of his properties had, of course, seen such upgrades, but he was a duke. He knew that most of his associates were still trying to decide whether or not the upgrades were necessary. Alex wondered how he had ever lived without plumbing before, and grimaced at the thought that he would now have to relieve himself with his host in attendance. Stifling his sigh, he rolled his eyes in disgust with himself. If he hadn't had the harebrained idea of pulling Rose into the broom-closet in the first place, he would not be in this current predicament. He consoled himself with the lopsided reasoning that it could have been much worse. If the ambassador had been just a moment or two earlier, he would have seen Rose exiting the broom-closet, and if he had investigated at all, they would have all been in the suds, as Rosie had said. But then again, from what she had told him, Alex could imagine that Rose would be able to brazen her way out of the situation even more skillfully than he had. And, no doubt, the affable ambassador would have been happy to escort a giggling debutante to the ladies' retiring room. Within a few moments, the questionable ordeal was over, and Alex was able to make his way back to the ballroom. He was just in time to see Rose in conversation with Lady Anne and Lord Edgecombe. The Duke found himself consumed with curiosity over what they could possibly be talking about. It crossed his mind that he should be trying to hide his interest, but he could not tear his eyes away as he watched Rose animatedly talking, while the other two looked on in fascination.